All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and I've been going over our PowerPoint presentations or slides for Murachs, HTML, and CSS3 3rd edition for the AWD Application and Web Development AWD1000 Web Technologies class. And I'm on Chapter 4, about a third of the way through, and now we're going to talk about HTML that can be selected by type, ID, or class. All right, and I'm going to try to catch back up again in the book. There we go. All right, so we've got some HTML5 elements. We've got a main and a footer. Notice we also have a class here of blue that we're using for our these two paragraphs, and a class of copyright and a class of blue right that we're using for the footer. So what do we have here? Well, again, blue, copyright, and blue right. All right, blue says we want the color to be blue. Right says we want the text right aligned. All right, so if we want everything to have this kind of margin, we use the asterisk, which stands for the Universal Type Selector. If I want to do it by element, so this says in main, everything that's in main should have a 2 pixel solid black border drawn around it and 1 em of padding. Again, we'll talk about padding when we get to about chapter 5 or 6. All of our H1 tags should use the Arial font family if possible, and if not, should use sans serif. All of our paragraphs should have a 3em left margin. Our copyright should be 80% of the regular size, so not 100% size, 80%. This has got the hashtag, which means that copyright is an ID. These have the period, which means blue and right are both classes. Blue says whatever we're using on, the color should be blue. Right says whatever we're using on should be text aligned right. So blue right, these are two different classes. We're applying the blue class and the right class. Notice you put a space between them, not a comma. So this is saying that the copyright, the footer, should have an ID of copyright, so it should be 80% of its regular size. It should have a class of blue, which means it should be blue in color, and it should be right, which means it should be right aligned. And you see how it is. All right. HTML can also be selected, as they mentioned here, by what are called relationships. For instance, notice that this UL has a class of speakers, okay? These 3 LIs are children of the UL with a class of speakers. Everything that's in here directly, the H1, the UL, the H2, this P, and this P, they're all direct children or direct descendants of main. So this says that basically anything, this first one is a Descendant Selectors. This says that any LI, any list item that's inside of main should only be 90% of its regular size. This says any anchor tag that's in an unordered list should be green in color. All right? Those are called Descendant Selectors because, it is, the LI is a descendant or child or grandchild or whatever. All right, it's contained within another element. The A is contained within a UL. The next group that are there are an adjacent sibling selector. And they're at the same level. For instance, H1, UL, H2, and P, all of these, they're siblings. They're all at the same level as one another. So when you want to code an adjacent sibling, you use the plus sign here. So in this example, this will select any P element that is adjacent to an H2. So in other words, any P that follows an H2. So it'll be just that paragraph. Not all paragraphs. This is the only one adjacent to this. we next have a child selector. And you notice how the sibling used the plus sign and the child selector uses the greater than sign. So if you want to select elements only when they're child elements of a parent, you use that child selector. Here, the first child selector selects the paragraph elements that are children of main, and the second one selects anchor elements that are children of LI. All right. There's also a general sibling selector, and as you can see, it's new for CSS3. It uses what's called a tilde, and that selects any sibling whether or not the elements are adjacent. So in this figure, it would select all paragraph elements that follow any H2 element. So whereas earlier it would only select the first one, this would select all three. All right. You can also use what are called combinations of selectors. I've even seen this called combinators. All right. So this first group of examples that you see here, it shows you how to code these. All right. To select an element by class name, for example, you code the element name, UL, all right, followed by a period, followed by the class name. So this selects all UL elements with a class of speakers. You can also code multiple selectors of the same rule set. The first one that's here, this says I want to take all H1 and all H2 and all H3 tags. They don't need to have a class or an ID associated with them. Make them all blue. This says all paragraphs, all unordered lists, all list items, all right, that are part of the speakers class, that are part of an unordered list, should have a font family of Times New Roman, and if you can't find that, serif. Notice since Times New Roman has blank spaces in it, you need the double quotes, but since serif is one word, no double quotes are necessary. Now this gets a little bit, as we go on in here, there are attribute selectors. This says that basically all elements that with href attributes, so anything in an href should be 95%. This says all A elements, all the hrefs in there should have an Arial font, and if you can't find that, a sans serif font. This says all input elements, all right, with the type submit, so that's usually going to be a submit button, will look like this. A 1-pixel solid black border, this color, that background color. All right. A while ago we talked, and I mentioned to you these pseudo classes. And technically pseudo means false. Now, these are different things that you can put on hyperlinks. Okay? So you've got link, and that's a link that has not yet been viewed. By default, links are always blue and underlined. Visited, which is a link that has been visited. By default, that's purple and underlined. Active, which means you push down on the link, but you have not yet released it. By default, that's usually red and underlined. Hover, where your mouse is hovering over it, but you haven't clicked it yet. And focus, which you can use with an element like a link or a form control that currently has the focus. If you decide to use, let's say, all of these, you put them in this order. Link, visited, active, hover, and focus. I'm not going to worry about the focus, but let's look at these other ones here. All right? So, let's see. I'm going to come back to over here, and we got a lot of stuff in here again. Let's just go and we'll just use our very simple little paragraph that we have. Now is the time for all good people to come to the end of their party. We'll just put that in there, and we'll comment out everything else. So just so you see this, if I run it now, this is back to where I've just got that, and that's fine. Okay? But I'm going to change the text that's in here. Let me close. I've got a lot of things open here, so let me close a bunch of these. We'll just leave that one open. All right. So let's put a paragraph in here, and we'll say this is the URL for, and we'll put a href equals http://www.rankin.edu, and we'll put in here Rankin Technical College. Please click it for more info. Okay? And you'll see that when we do this and I run it, all of the defaults will be there. In other words, it's already been clicked, but if I click on it, notice how it's red, etc. If I hover over it, okay, so let's change some of those. In fact, let's change every one of those. So we've got a color for our paragraph, and that's fine. But let's come over here and say link. All right, so that's a link that has not yet been visited. Well, we don't have one of those, but we'll create one. So let's make it color, and we'll make it gold. I think gold will take, but we'll find out. Otherwise, I'll change it to yellow. And we'll say text decoration none, which means we don't want the underline to go there. All right, now you're not going to see this if we run it, but let's put a different URL in here. Okay, shouldn't have clicked there, but that's okay. So we're going to change this to from, we'll leave that one in there. Here is the Google link, I don't know. All right, now when we run this, the one for Google, since we haven't done it yet, should be yellow and not or golden and not underlined. Here's Google. Well, it looks like it didn't recognize that color, so let's try putting in a different color. So we've got colon link, should be a colon link. Maybe that's why it didn't work, so let's try that. All right, a colon link, and let's run this again. Oh, still isn't working. Thought gold was a color, but I could very well be wrong. Let's say pink. So a colon link. Still isn't working. Thought that I put that in there correctly. Let me take a look in the book here and see if they've got it in there any differently. A colon link color. Yeah, that should be correct. I've saved, and I've saved. Style, which, and if you look, I commented out the link to my style sheet. That's why it's not working. All right, so there's that goofy color, but notice it's now pink and it doesn't have the underline. So let's go in here and let's get rid of, in my style sheet, let's get rid of the color for our paragraphs. So this will be black again for our paragraph text. All right, so a little easier to read. And you can notice now too, I've lost the underline for both of them. When I put my mouse over it, the pointer still changes. All right. So we've changed that one. Next, let's come in and choose visited. So anyone that's visited, let's make that green. And we will not have the text decoration of none in there. All right, so I've saved. Let's go in and try to run that again. You see that that's green, And I think that the other one is overwriting this for the underline, but I'm not worried about it. All right. Notice if I click to go to Google, and then I come back again to my website, notice how it's changed back to its color. And also notice that when I click on here, okay, how it turns red on both of those. All right. Why does it turn red? Because red is the default color for active. So if we don't want it to be red, okay, I'll say color gray. I don't know if it's G-R-E-Y or A-Y. I think it'll take either one, but we're going to find out. See how it's gray? Okay. And finally there's hover. Alright, so when we're hovering over it with our mouse, okay, let's have there the color be I don't know if there's a dark blue or not. We're going to find out. See how I'm hovering? How it changes to dark blue? So that was very, very, very simplistic example, but the idea there was to show you how to use some of those pseudo classes. In fact, virtually all of them right there. All right, so the author does go through, but it does give some examples in the book. Okay. Not only are there pseudo classes, there are other ones like first child, last child, and only child. All right. The first one in there, let's see, let's take a look at the examples that are here. No, they're not showing them. Okay. All right. The first child selects the first child of an element. All right, so in other words, if I wanted to come in here and choose the first paragraph, it would be that one, because that's the first paragraph of main type of thing. All right? The last child would be the last child in the element, so if I wanted the last paragraph, I could choose that one. Only child would select if I had just one child in an element. So in other words, if this UL had only one LI in it, type of an idea. There's also a first letter and a first line that you can choose, okay? You're going to see these in much more depth and breadth of coverage as we go on. So the author put a bunch of stuff in here where if you look, there's the hrefs. All right, and they put in link, color green, so you notice the ones that haven't been clicked yet have got green in color. All right, when you hover over them, they're fuchsia, so if your mouse is hovering over it, you haven't clicked, but your mouse is hovering over it, you get that fuchsia. All right, the first child of main, the first paragraph, should be bold, so that's the first paragraph. All right, and the first letter should be 150%. That's very similar to what I showed you earlier with that span tag. All right. Notice, apply the same formatting to the hover and focus pseudo classes for an element. That way those who can't use the mouse will have the same experience as those who can. Always be thinking of everyone who may conceivably be using your website. All right. Okay, the next thing that's in here is this important tag. And what this tag says is, I don't care if you've got something that has a class of highlight, all right, then whatever it is, you want to make its font weight bold. And even if something else has tried, that is tried to overwrite it and may seem more important or higher level in the hierarchy, do it anyway. That's what the important tag means, for lack of better words. Now, you should know that you can overuse that. So if an element has more than one rule applied to it, then the important will take precedence. But you shouldn't go taking everything on your page and making it important. All right? So if you notice in here, it says that when it's going through this, it does the important rules for a style sheet first, then any important rules you set for the web page inside of the web page, then any normal rules for the web page, then any normal rules in the style sheet, then the default. So they're trying to show you the regular way of taking a look at what's in here. All right, the default mechanism. If more than one rule is applied to the same element, you use the one with the highest specificity. An ID is the most specific, a class is less specific, an element is even less specific than that. So remember, only one ID per page, as many classes as you want, and this would be like, so this would be an ID for maybe a certain paragraph. This would be a class that was maybe would color anything, paragraphs, unordered lists, whatever, and this would be for all paragraphs or all unordered lists, etc. So let's not do their example here. Let's bring up a web page, not this one because there's really nothing in it. Oh, I guess we could try this one. But we're going to come in here, and I'm using the Chrome browser, and I'm going to hit the F12 function key. Okay, and there's my code, and what it's bringing up in here is basically the Chrome developer tools. Now I can make this smaller. I don't know if I can make this bigger or not. I guess I can't. All right. But what you can do in here is you can go in and take a look. Okay, right now I'm in console, but if I go to elements, there we go. I can see how everything is set up in here. So you can see it's got all of my source in here, even the stuff that's been commented out. And it says, oh, look, my styles. Well, first I put in this reset, so there's all those styles. And it's showing you here the way that stuff is going to look, and that's by using what's called the Css Box Model, which is the subject of Chapter 5, so I'm not going to talk about it right now. But to display these Chrome developer tools, all right, you can go in there and hit your F12 key. Hitting an F12 again turns it off. Now, if I come in here, and let's just put in CNN.com. All right, so here's CNN's page for about 7 o'clock a.m. on the 11th of January 2018. So if I hit F12, the page is still here, but this is all the stuff that makes up that CSS page. So if I wanted to come in here and be able to try things, I'd be able to do them. All right. So if you look right here, notice background color, and it's got a color in here. I'm going to try something. I don't know if this is going to work or not, but I'm going to put in here. Nope, that's not what I wanted. This is the one I wanted. Pound, F, 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 F. Well, I thought it was going to change our background color here, but you can actually go in. We'll go through an exercise on this in the class. Okay? All right. So to display the Chrome developer tools, you hit F12. To inspect the styles for an element, so if I wanted to see how this picture was styled, all right. I could come in here and I could click on the picture and it's going to find it in here, okay, someplace. I don't want to use that. Let's see if we can find it something else, a different picture or something. All right. So it'll show us eventually. We'll be able to find out where that is, and we can take a look at the styles that have been applied to that. All right. One of the primary uses of these developers tools is to inspect the styles that somebody else has applied to an element in, if you want to go and look at some other website, for example. All right? I don't want to get off on too big a tangent. I'm already spending way too much time. This is going to have to be 3 presentations rather than 2. All right, there are 5 generic font families. There is serif, that are fonts that have what are considered to be a tapered, flared type of font. There's sans serif, that it's more plain looking. There's monospace, where you have the same width for each character. There's cursive, where the fonts are connected. It looks more like handwriting. And there's fantasy, which is decorative. So serif is here. Sans serif is here. Monospace is here. Cursive is here. And fantasy is here. So the fonts you specified are put in the order in which you list them. So this says try to do Arial. If you can't find Arial, try to do Helvetica. If you can't find Helvetica, you should always put at the end a serif or a sans serif or something like that. I will tell you too, because we will talk about this in class, that you can also go out to Google Fonts, and literally under Google Fonts there are, last time I checked, it was still about 848 fonts. So if I like this font right here, all right, I can come in here and I can add that particular font. Okay? So I can add that font to the system, and we're going to go and we're going to do that as we're going to build a website. We'll start building that website about when we get to the end of Chapter 8. All right? I will be taping that as well. You can specify font family, font size, and when you do the font size, it can be in absolute measurements like points or relative measurements like percentages or ems. Okay? You can put all the, this is a font family, so this, what does this says? For paragraphs, all paragraphs should have Times New Roman. If you can't find it, Times. If you can't find that, serif. All right, here it says for the body, so the whole document, unless you overwrite it, have Arial. If you can't find it, have Helvetica. If you can't find it, have sans serif. Have it be 100% font size. Some of the other properties you can use are font style, which are italic, normal. All right, I think oblique is the other one, which is very similar to italic. Font variant, which, as it says, if you want things in small capital letters, you may have seen that. A lot of times you'll do that for the first paragraph on a page. You'll take the first sentence and make it in small capital letters. Font weights, you can do this in 2 ways. You can give it bold, 3 ways really, okay? You can give it a number that I think goes from like about 100 to 900 or something like that. All right, 400 is the default. Plus you can use things like lighter, darker, etc. Line height, all right. You can again use points, which are absolute measurements, or percentages or ems, all right, which are relative measurements. And if you leave them off, I think it defaults to either ems or percentages. So 140% is the same thing as 1.4 ems. All right. You can combine a bunch of font things together. So this says I want an italic font that's bolded, that's 14 pixels. All right. I don't know what the 14 slash, I've never seen that before. I'm sure that's listed in the book. This says I want my font to be a small caps, 150%, and I want it to be one of these 3 types of font families, starting with try to find Times New Roman. If you can't find that, use Times. If you can't find that, use sans serif. I'm just going to plot along. I'm blowing this up already. I'm already at 30 minutes, but I only want there to be 2 presentations maximum per chapter. So I'm going to go through these last 15 or 20 slides kind of quickly. So you can do text indentations. You can do text aligns. The indentation can be relative or absolute. The align can be left, center, right, or justified. And you can also vertically align. It determines the vertical alignment of text. Do you want it as high up as possible, as low up as possible, centered, etc.? The text decoration I already showed you. So notice they've done a little bit of dinking around here. All right. Text shadows, which are pretty much, is that the last thing that's discussed in here? Almost. All right, so we're getting close to the end of the chapter. Text shadows you can do a lot of things here, and you do it typically for effect. You see that? That's a little ugly. But you'll notice the H1 says I want it to be this color, and I want it to have a text shadow. All right. So in that example, you've got a text shadow that is 4 pixels to the right and down with no blur, and the shadow should be the same color as the text. A little hard to read. That one looks a little nicer, and you'll notice it's in red, so the shadow part is red. It's the same, pretty much the same thing. All right. Except in this example here, it's offset to the left and up by 2 pixels, so you're moving it around. So again, this is the kind of thing that you would use for an effect. Remember, when you're doing this, remember visually impaired people. All right, if you put too much shadow or blur in there, it makes it hard for them to read. All right, again, positive values like we looked at here. All right, positive values offset the shadow to the right and down, negative to left and up. You can put blur in there. I guess they don't have any examples, but with blur, it determines how much of the shadow is blurred looking. Okay, the shadow property is supported by all modern browsers, and if you use an older browser, it's typically ignored anyway, so you don't have to worry about it. All right. Floating. Here's an image that's been floated to the left. If you didn't put float left here, then what would happen is all of the other text that goes below it, this H1 tag and this H2 tag, would go down below the image. But float says move it over and left as far as you can, and then start putting the other stuff, fill in the rest of the page. All right, instead of going down, it's treating it as though, rather than it being a block level tag where there's a space after it, it's treating it more like it's an inline tag. All right. So here it says the image is reduced to 40. So the image is now 40% of the size it was before. There's all sorts of different effects that you can get when you do this. All right. If you float, everything will float and keep floating until you clear it. All right. You can clear left, clear right, or clear both. So you can get some different kinds of special effects. And as it says, starting on page 156, and we've only got about 6 pages left in the chapter, this is a web page that uses the different styles that were presented in the chapter. So they've got their normalized style sheet, which I use the reset instead, then their main style sheet. All right, they've got a class in here of date passed. So you notice when the date is passed already, it's gray. We're assuming we're in January now. And you notice that's not. So these speakers have been grayed out. And I think that'll mean that you can't choose them anymore. I'm not sure. We've got an indent class in here. So you can see how that paragraph and this one are both indented. There are multiple ways that you can do this stuff. They are showing an example, and then here and on page 159 in the book, I should say page 161 in the book, they're showing the associated CSS. All right? So, we started with this, and we've got a couple more pages in here that are also done. And that's it for this chapter. So we went through that, believe it or not, kind of quickly. This was jumping into CSS head first, and we looked at how to use CSS to format the elements on a page. Now I'm going to do a file open here, and I'm going to open up Chapter 5, which is our next chapter, and Chapter 5 is using that CSS box model. So I'll be back with that soon.